Well, this is it. It's the big one. This is the heart of the Christian faith, the gospel message. There's more to the gospel than this message, but without this message, there is no gospel. The Apostle Paul, in the great resurrection chapter, which Bill, our lay reader, referred to, chapter 15, by the way, we've got it printed there for you, goes on to say a few verses after what we have printed there in verse 14, if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain, and your faith is in vain. So that's why we're here, because He is risen. I just love Luke's recording of the gospel, because it's not a loud, boisterous, Billy Graham type of exponential stem winder story. It's a story about the events of Easter that reflect the reactions and the responses of ordinary human beings like you and me. And I'd like to review with you some of those groups and their response to what happened. One group, the first group I'd like to mention, isn't even mentioned here. It happened in those hours following Jesus' crucifixion and then His placement in the tomb. There was a group who remembered His words. They remembered that Jesus said that He would rise on the third day. This group were the enemies of Christ. They were the religious leaders of their day, and they didn't want anyone to mess up their control of things, much less somebody posting or staging some fraud where people would say, oh, look, the grave's empty, He's risen. So they asked the governor to post guards at the tomb. And he did. Because they're concerned, they remembered His words that He would die and on the third day rise again. They remembered. Oddly enough, they're the only one of the groups that actually remember without being reminded. But the enemies, they remembered His words that He would rise again. So they posted the guard outside the tomb. Wrong place, guys. Outside the tomb. Kind of reminds me of all these floods we've had. What a nightmare for homeowners and business owners in Rhode Island and New England and the upper Midwest has had their floods too. And it reminds me of a story I heard about this engineer in Nova Scotia who, in order to protect his property from the high tides, built this dike. And it was engineered to perfection, and for years it worked perfectly until one day it stopped working completely. It fell over on the beach. And the reason it fell over is because though the engineer designed it to withstand all the forces of the rising tide, he had failed to calculate the undertow forces of erosion from the other side of the wall. You see, there at the tomb, the soldiers were standing on the outside so that no disciples could get in. But they couldn't stop Jesus from getting out. And that's exactly what happened. Now, again, it's as if Luke sucked all the sensationalism out of this story, because as the story begins, you have it right there, verse 1 and following, the women are coming to the tomb expecting what? They're carrying these spices. They're expecting to honor the body of their dead friend whom they dearly love and miss. They don't want to do this, but they have to do this. And so they're going. And the first thing they notice is that the stone is rolled away. Now, I don't hear the women all gathering together and say, okay, everybody together, he is risen. No. They kind of look at each other, and you've got it right there in, was it verse 3 or 4? So it uses the word perplexed. They saw something else. They walked inside, and the body was gone. And they were perplexed. Oh, it gets better. In fact, I'm kind of reminded of the adventures of Mark Twain and Huckleberry Finn and all that. When Huck and Joe and Mark Twain, they all disappeared, and the town thought they were dead. And after a period of time, they arranged to have a memorial service for them. And those of you who know this story know that the boys found out about it and hid up in the balcony in the back of the church. And they heard the whole town give testimonials of how actually these boys really were good inside. They weren't that bad after all. And the preacher had a very consoling message until they heard a little ruckus in the choir loft, and out popped the three boys, to which the preacher led everybody in the doxology, praise God, from whom all blessings flow. You know the difference between that story and the story we have today? The people really didn't know for sure if the boys were dead. But these women knew. These women were at Golgotha. These women heard Jesus say, "It is finished." They saw him give up his spirit. They saw where they laid him in the tomb. That's why they knew where they were going. And then the two angels show up. And the reason I tell the Huck Finn story is I kind of pictured Jesus today in my weird sort of way, being up there in the balcony. Hello, choir. And we're all up there in the balcony with Jesus as the women are coming to the tomb, and Jesus is going, "Watch this. You're going to love this." And here come these two men in dazzling white. And they say, "Why do you seek the living among the dead? He is not here, for he has risen." And these women don't say again, "He is risen indeed." Instead, it says they were what? Terrified. What does this mean? Human beings with normal human reactions. And then verse 8. And please look at verse 8, if you would, right now. Verse 8 says, then the angels reminded him, remember what he told you. Remember. He said that he would die, but after 3 days would rise again. And verse 8 says, then they remembered his words. Then the lights went on and the bells went off. Sort of. Because then they took this message back to the 11 who were huddled behind locked doors for fear they'd be next. They crucified Jesus. They're coming for us. And they said, you're not going to believe what we just saw and heard. And the disciples didn't. What's the words there in verse 11? They thought of it as an idle tale. An idle tale. Now here's where, Luke could have put a little bit of fireworks in this story at this time, because it mentions the women by name, and one of the women is Mary, the mother of James. Mary, the mother of James. James, one of the 11, who's telling Ma, that's an idle tale. Now, I'm just saying, if this were Steve telling Trudy Hess that was an idle tale, I'm telling you, Luke would have something to write about. But Luke understands. God understands.